Welcome to the New Institute series, Discovering Servant Leadership. In the signature lecture, we provided a biblical framework for a life of Christian leadership. In the first module, we discussed faith, love, and service as the foundation for a life of Christian leadership. In the next module, we discussed the power model of leadership that Jesus rejected and the service model that embodies the teachings of Jesus. In this module, we'll be looking at the characteristics of servant leaders. Servant leadership is a field of study and practice all over the world. There are servant leadership institutes and centers in many different countries. Hundreds of colleges teach servant leadership in their leadership courses. There are, of course, many books and research articles published on servant leadership, and most of them include a list of characteristics. Of course, for us, Jesus is the ultimate example of a servant leader. How would we describe him? Well, maybe we could look at how he described himself. He said, "I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep." Michael Youssef, in his book, The Leadership Style of Jesus, grew up in the Middle East, and he said he had many opportunities to watch shepherds interacting with their sheep. And he said they were just totally dedicated to the welfare of their sheep, making sure that they were safe and well fed at all times. He said day or night, they were ready to leap into action to protect the sheep. So when Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd," he is saying that he truly loves the flock, and he is willing to sacrifice for the flock's benefit. I like to think of servant leaders as simply people who focused on serving others. They love people and they want to help them. So they are focused on identifying and meeting the needs of others. Aubrey Malphurs, in his book, Being Leaders, says there are 4 characteristics of the servant leader. The first is humility, then service, focus on others, and then love. So he defines servant leadership as the humble service of others based on our love for them. James C. Hunter wrote a book called The Servant, in which he used the first verses of 1 Corinthians 13 about love to create his own list of characteristics. And those included patience, kindness, humility, respectfulness, selflessness, forgiveness, commitment, and honesty. Robert Greenleaf, who launched the modern servant leadership movement, said that, of course, the desire to serve is the most important characteristic, but he also talked about listening and understanding, empathy and acceptance, foresight, persuasion, conceptualization, awareness, self-healing, and rebuilding community. Scholars develop their own lists of characteristics in order to do their research. They come up with a list of characteristics that they can test for to see about the impact of servant leadership in the workplace. Dr. Robert C. Leyden, who's a professor of management at the University of Illinois at Chicago, came up with a list that he has used with his colleagues to do research all over the world. Those 7 dimensions that they use include emotional healing, conceptual skills, creating value for the community, helping those served to grow and succeed, putting followers first, and behaving ethically. Some people have a problem with the words themselves, servant and leader, being put together that way, because in most cultures, a servant would be somebody of low status or no status and no power, and then leader would be somebody of some status and some power, and it creates a certain tension and maybe some confusion. Well, I think the best explanation is that the foundational word is servant. Servant leaders are characterized by their servant's heart. They are servants before, during, and after they have a leadership position. So you might say they're sometimes a servant leader, but always a servant. That's who Jesus said he was. He said, "I am among you as one who serves." Servant leaders really can be anyone. They can be business leaders, government leaders, they can be nonprofit leaders, military commanders, they can be teachers, coaches, social workers, parents, friends. And servant leaders do what other leaders do. They articulate a vision, they manage, they communicate, and so on. What distinguishes them from other leaders is their focus on others, not just themselves, and they want to make life better for others, not just themselves. I find it easy to see that difference in the kinds of questions that people ask themselves when they make decisions on a daily basis. We said that the power model of a leadership is about acquiring and wielding power. So a person who is in the power model, who sits down to make a decision, could ask questions like this. Well, what decision will enhance my power? What decision will be a great way to increase my visibility? What decision will be a good way to get ahead of my chief rival? What decision will improve my relationship with my boss? What decision will enhance my prospects for my next promotion? These are all questions about the leader and how to turn that decision into the leader's personal advantage. Well, the service model of leadership is about making a difference in the lives of others. So a servant leader will ask a completely different set of questions. A servant leader will ask, what are the most important needs we should be addressing? If we address this need, will we harm someone or leave someone out? If so, is there a way to reduce or mitigate that harm? Is there a way to include the people who might be left out? What decision would be most consistent with the mission and goals and values of my organization? What decision would be most beneficial to the people we serve? Those are not questions about the leaders. Those are questions about the organization and the people it exists to serve. So you ask different questions, you get different answers, you make different decisions, and over time you move in different directions. The power-oriented leader moves toward getting things she or he wants personally. The servant leader moves toward getting the things other people need. One of the characteristics of servant leadership is that it's situational. Why is that? Well, it's situational because most situations are different, and so the servant leader adjusts. Wilkes said of Jesus, he said that he took into account the context of the situation. He could be as gentle as a lamb or as courageous as a lion. He could be a conformist or he could be an iconoclast. It depended on the context. So servant leaders don't have a single style of leadership. I mean, a style of leadership is about the leader, right? And servant leadership's not about the leader, it's about identifying and meeting the needs of others. So there isn't a single style. It's whatever is needed to address the situation and to help people. One of the problems with having a style, a single style, is that sometimes it's appropriate and sometimes it's not. There's a saying that a person who's a hammer thinks every problem is a nail. Well, that's all they can do. They've only got a hammer. Well, servant leaders aren't like that. They're not a hammer. They're the entire toolbox. They can use whatever tool is needed to address the situation. To give a couple of obvious examples, if you're the captain of a ship and it's sinking, you become authoritarian. You issue commands. You got to get people into the lifeboats. I mean, you need to listen to make sure you're accurate at issuing appropriate commands, but you need to be very authoritarian. That's how you're going to serve people. That's how you're going to save lives. But if you're working with a group of volunteers on a community project and you're trying to chair the project, you're not going to be issuing any commands or any orders. You're going to be facilitating the discussion and helping the group to come to an understanding of what the project needs to be and eventually become committed to it. A very different approach. Different situation requires different leadership. So servant leaders adapt. They're situational. One of the characteristics of servant leaders is that they're willing to do what they can to help someone, even if it seems like a small thing at the time. They know that, if it's about making a difference, any difference can be a meaningful difference, even if it doesn't turn out to be a big difference. That's one of the things that I like about the parable of the Good Samaritan. He was traveling, he saw an injured man by the side of the road, and he stopped and decided to help him. It was just a loving act of service. It didn't have to be a big thing. It didn't have to lead to anything else. I mean, it didn't have to form an organization and set up a regional committee and come up with a national plan and apply for major funding. It didn't have to be a big thing. It was just the right thing. It was just a loving thing to do. Of course, an act of service can lead to something big. I'm thinking here of George Williams. George Williams was a young man who worked in a draper's shop in London in 1844. Like many other young men in London at the time, he worked 10, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. He slept in a crowded room over the shop where he worked. George Williams noticed that there weren't a lot of moral or healthy things for young men like him to do in their free time. And so he gathered together a group of drapers who decided to form a Christian fellowship of young men who would support each other and help each other to grow in mind and spirit. That's all George Williams was trying to do. He wasn't trying to do anything bigger than that. But it was a good idea, and others liked it, and it caught on. And today it's the YMCA. It serves 45 million men, women, and children in 119 countries. He didn't know that. He didn't set out to do something big, but it became big. Servant leaders are often people who are willing to take a risk on behalf of others. I'd like to tell you the story of Will Hartzell. Will Hartzell is a friend of mine. He lives here in Hawaii. Years ago, he learned that every year millions of people die from drinking contaminated water. And he knew that didn't have to happen. And he made this deep personal commitment to do whatever he could to address that problem. Well, Will Hartzell was not a technologist. He wasn't an international business person. He had no particular skills that related to solving this problem. So everyone told him, you're just not going to be able to do it. Don't waste your time and money. It's not going to happen. But Will was willing to take the risk. He was willing to risk the time and money just for the opportunity to make a difference that he wanted to make. So against all the things that the naysayers told him, he founded his own company. It was called Safe Water Systems, and he founded it in 1996. He got a team together and they developed what he called a solar water pasteurizer, which is basically like the solar water heaters that people put on their roofs, but had some special equipment that would heat the water at sufficient level to actually kill germs and so forth. So they had basically a simple low-cost solution. They started installing this technology in other countries. One of the very first projects left an indelible mark on Will's memory. It was in Africa, in Tanzania. At the Selian Hospital near Arusha. This hospital did not have clean drinking water. They didn't have a disinfection system. So you could go to the hospital healthy and end up getting sick at the hospital from drinking their water. So they installed the solar water pasteurizer, and Will stood outside and was watching patients and members of the family come out and get the clean water and take it back into the hospital. And one lady came out and started filling her bottle. It turned out that she was at the hospital because her child was gravely ill. Well, she filled her water bottle and then she turned and she looked at Will. And their eyes met in what Will remembers as a time-stopping moment. And she said something. And then she turned and walked back into the hospital. Well, Will didn't know what she said. He didn't speak the language. So he turned to the nurse and he said, what did she say? She said, "Thank you. Thank you for giving my child the chance to live." And that's when Will knew that he was going to do whatever he could to provide safe drinking water to as many people as possible all over the world. Fast forward 20 years, Will and his colleagues have installed 4,000 solar water pasteurizers and other water purification equipment in 53 countries. The result is that 400,000 people no longer have to risk illness or death from drinking contaminated water. Will Hartzell is a servant leader who took the risk and is saving lives every day. Will is not famous. He's not trying to be famous. Like most servant leaders, he's not seeking recognition. He's just seeking to make a difference, and he is. Often you will see a servant leader who is simply giving back. People have helped that person, they want to help others in turn. I think of Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was born into slavery in the early 1820s in Maryland. As a teenager, working as a field hand, she was hit in the head with a big piece of metal that the overseer was throwing at another slave, causing an injury that was painful for the rest of her life. In 1849, her owner died, and she got help. She was able to make it to the north through the Underground Railway. That's a system of secret homes and tunnels and roads that were used by abolitionists and freed slaves to help slaves make it from the south to freedom in the north. So she was free. She made it to Philadelphia, but she decided to give back. She decided to go back to the south to help others to become free. So between 1850 and 1860, she made many trips back to the South, helped free hundreds of slaves, including her brothers and her parents. Southerners put out a reward on her head, trying to capture her. She had to resettle a lot of people in Canada where they couldn't be recaptured. She continued to do this for at least 10 years, and then the Civil War broke out. And she served as a nurse for black soldiers and freed slaves in Union camps. She served as a Union scout and spy behind Confederate lines. She even led the attack on a Confederate outpost and freed 700 slaves. After the war, she worked hard to support women's rights. And toward the end of her life, she set up a home for the elderly next to her house in Auburn, New York. Harriet Tubman was a servant leader who gave back and helped other people to gain their freedom and their rights. Servant leaders often take a stand for what is right. One of my favorite stories is a fictional story. It's the story of Atticus Finch, the attorney and father, in To Kill a Mockingbird, the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel by Harper Lee. The story is set in a southern town in the 1930s. And the situation is that Atticus Finch, the lawyer, who's played by Gregory Peck in the movie, he has taken on the case of Tom Robinson, a black man who has been unjustly accused of raping a white woman. Well, because of the racial passions of the time, the jury ignores the obvious facts, and Tom is found guilty. He doesn't believe that he's going to get better treatment on appeal, and so in desperation, he tries to escape, and he's shot and killed. So Atticus lost the trial, but the important thing is that he put himself in the hands of others at their service, and he stood for what was right. After the guilty verdict was read in the courtroom, he went over to say a few reassuring words to Tom. Then he chatted briefly with a court reporter. Then he turned back to the table to pack up his books and papers. Well, the black community was up on the balcony. They'd been watching. And as Atticus packed up his books and papers, gradually, one by one, they began standing up in a silent gesture of respect. Atticus's daughter, Jean Louise, was up on the balcony too. And as Atticus turned to leave the courtroom, Reverend Sykes turned to her and he said, Miss Jean Louise, stand up. Your father's passing. I'd like to read you a story, a true story, about a servant leader who stood up for what was right. In 1945, at the end of World War II, a captain in the U.S. Marine Corps landed in Tsingtao, China. There weren't many Americans around, so he bunked at a local hotel and took his meals with the nationalist Chinese general, who was the leader of the Chinese bandits outside of Tsingtao. The Marine captain's assignment was to assist in the arrangements for the surrender of Japanese forces in northern China. His first tasks were to recruit dock workers to unload transports and to secure housing for the Marines who would be arriving soon. It was a time of transition from war to peace, from combat and field conditions to office and barracks duty. Some of the Marines who arrived in Tsingtao had spent their entire careers in combat and had no experience with barracks duty. One of these, a young, newly promoted Marine sergeant, was assigned duty as sergeant of the guard at the barracks in Tsingtao. In that role, he signed for 35 alpaca vests, accepting them as part of the guard property. When relieved of duty the next day, only 2 of the vests could be located. Winter was approaching, living quarters were not heated, and the vests were prized possessions. 33 vests had disappeared. About the same time that the sergeant was signing for the vests, Marine Corps headquarters issued an order requiring strict property accounting. For the previous 2 years, there had been little or no accounting. The Marines were too busy fighting the war to worry about inventories and forms. However, now it was peacetime. New orders were in effect, and the sergeant was brought up on a court-martial for the missing vests. The captain agreed to serve as defense counsel for the sergeant in the general court-martial case. The captain began investigating and determined that he would have to call to the stand the regimental adjutant, the battery commander, several officers of the day, several sergeants of the guard, the regimental executive, and the regimental commander. He would have to call them because they were on site or in command before, during, or after the vests disappeared. Calling them to the stand would have put each of them in the court-martial record, which would go to Marine Corps headquarters in Washington, D.C. for review. This was a sensitive time for the officers in the chain of command. Many were reservists who were seeking regular commissions after the war. Others were seeking duty assignments that would advance their careers. The captain began to receive phone calls from these officers asking why he was going to such lengths on behalf of a buck sergeant. The captain was called in to talk with the regimental adjutant, then the regimental executive, and then the regimental commander, all three of whom outranked him. Each of the three men suggested that it would be best for all concerned, certainly for the captain, if the captain did not call them as witnesses. The captain was a reservist, and he wanted a career in the Marine Corps. It was clear to him that upsetting his senior officers was not the way to get a regular commission and continue his career. But he was not deterred. He informed his superior officers that he would have to call them to the stand to establish the facts of the case. The pressure increased. The Marine Division threw a party one Saturday night at a hotel, and the captain was invited to attend. Once he got there, he was asked to come in and say hello to the assistant division commander. The assistant division commander talked about the upcoming court-martial and said that he was personally worried about the captain's actions and how they might affect his request for a regular commission. The assistant division commander mentioned that his boss, the division commander, was being kept informed. Following that encounter, the battalion commander also visited the captain to suggest that he ease off. The captain listened politely to each of them. He knew his career was on the line, but he didn't think the sergeant was guilty, and he didn't think that it was fair for the sergeant to take the fall. Again, he had a decision to make, and he made it. He told the assistant division commander and the battalion commander that he couldn't ease off. Monday afternoon, the next regular training day, the sergeant came running to the captain's office with astonishing news. He had just come from the barracks where he had found 33 alpaca vests on his bunk. They weren't Marine Corps vests, but U.S. Navy vests apparently secured from Navy ships in the area. Together, the captain and the sergeant took the vests over to the office of the sergeant of the guard and got a signed receipt. The sergeant of the guard notified the regimental adjutant that the vests had been located and accounted for. The following day, the captain and sergeant received word that the court-martial would not be held and all charges had been dropped. The sergeant was promoted again before leaving the Marine Corps a few years later with an honorable discharge. The captain who risked his career to fight for an underdog received the regular commission he sought and rose through the ranks to become a colonel, serving with distinction for 30 years. 7 or 8 years after the Tsingtao court-martial incident, the captain was selected to work closely with the man who had been the division commander who was being kept informed about the court-martial. The division commander had become the commandant, the commanding general of the Marine Corps. The commandant wanted somebody he could trust. He knew he could trust the captain. The story had a happy ending, but the courage and the risk were real. I happen to know this story because I know the man who had the courage to take the risk. He passed away many years ago. He was my father. Servant leadership is so different from the power model of leadership that a lot of people don't understand it. There are a lot of misperceptions. One of the misperceptions is that if it's about serving, it can't be about leading. But of course, it's about serving by leading. Servant leaders really are leaders. One of the misperceptions is that servant leaders can't make hard decisions. They're soft. I've had the privilege to meet a number of servant leaders in my life, and they're not soft. They can make hard decisions when necessary, but how they make the decisions tends to be different than the way others make them. For example, a servant leader can fire an employee, but a servant leader doesn't say, wow, that person's not performing, fire him. A servant leader will say, well, why isn't the person performing? what's happening here? What are there issues or problems we can address? And so they'll look into it. Maybe the person needs more training. Maybe the person needs more coaching. If the support is provided and the person still can't perform, a servant leader might say, well, maybe it's just a bad fit. Is there some other job this person might be able to do? If there isn't another job or that job doesn't work out either, then the servant leader can terminate the employee. Servant leaders love people and they want them to succeed, but if they can't succeed with support, they can be let go. Another misperception is that servant leaders are nice and so they can't be competitive. You know, the expression, nice guys finish last. I mean, the implication is you've got to be mean and tough and, you know, and it's a hard-nosed competitive world. So you got to be out there and ready to fight. Adam Grant is a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and he got interested in this issue because he kept meeting people who were successful and they didn't seem to be mean or tough or even competitive in the normal sense. So he started doing some research. And his research is published in a book called Give and Take. He categorized people into givers, takers, and matchers. And the givers are basically the nice guys. The givers are people who help others. Well, what he found is that yes, givers, nice guys, do finish last. Givers, nice guys, also finish first. The difference seems to be that the givers, the nice guys who finish last, are so busy helping people they don't get their own work done. The ones who finish first do help others and manage to get their own work done as well. Grant said that givers are most effective in a team environment because they're helping other people. It means they're helping the members of the team so they can be more effective. He said that it actually creates a kind of ripple effect. So as the giver is successful, that ripple effect affects others in the team and they all succeed together. And I think that's what servant leaders do. They get their own work done, they help others, and the team moves forward. Another misperception is that if you're a servant leader, people will take advantage of you. Xiang Yang Tan said that, you know, just being a servant leader doesn't mean that you're a doormat that people can walk over or abuse or manipulate. This servanthood is a response to God's will, and God may guide us to lay down our life and sacrifice for others, but he also may guide us to say no and not feel guilty about it. My experience is that you don't have to do things if you don't want to do them. You can say, you know, you can be friendly, you can be firm and say, this is what I have these different tasks and things I'm doing, I have these resources. You know, I was in the habit of saying to someone who wanted me to do more than I could do, well, I'm doing all these things, what would you like me to stop doing or postpone doing so I can fit your project in instead? You know, you don't have to do other people's work or do things that you can't do if it's harmful to you or others, or it's just not possible to get it all done. So be friendly, but be firm. Another misperception is that servant leaders don't get results. I think that's ironic because I think servant leaders get more results. They get at least two kinds of results. And the first is, of course, in terms of the organization, you need to be able to get the resources to continue or expand the work of the organization. You need to generate a surplus or run a profit or whatever to keep going. But there's a second result that servant leaders get, and that is that by serving customers and clients and patients and members and students and citizens, by making the world a better place, they're actually enhancing the whole society. So it's a second result that they get that other leaders don't get. Scholars study all kinds of leadership theories and ideas, and they like to compare them. And my reading of the scholarship is that scholars have identified 4 things that they think are pretty unique about servant leadership compared to other ideas of leadership. One is the moral element. Second is focus on serving followers. The third is the concern for the success of all stakeholders. And the fourth is self-reflection as a way of combating hubris or vanity. So let's talk about each of those in turn. First of all, the moral elements. Servant leaders want to treat people right. Not only that, they want to create an environment in which people can raise moral issues and challenge decisions on a moral basis. That discussion can take place. Servant leaders also try to embed ethics in their operational principles. For example, serving people, helping people grow, exercising foresight, caring about everyone the organization touches. I'm really shocked that so many theories or ideas about leadership have no moral content. They're a description of skills or attitudes or techniques that you're supposed to use to get people to do things. And they can be used for good or for ill. That's what happened to transforming leadership. One of the most popular ideas of leadership in our community is called transformational leadership. But it began as transforming leadership. It came from a book by James McGregor Burns. It was about political leadership. And he said that leadership is morality applied to politics. I think that's great. The moral element is really clear. Well, the academics got a hold of that, and people like Bernard Bass changed it to transformational leadership, and they took the moral element out of it completely. So they said, you know, you can wear the black hat of a villain or the white hat of a hero. It doesn't matter in terms of the theory. You could be Hitler, you could be Gandhi. It doesn't make a difference in terms of the theory. Well, it makes a difference to servant leaders. Servant leaders are always trying to be ethical. That is one of the unique components or elements of servant leadership compared with other theories or ideas. Second is serving followers. So the idea here is that servant leaders don't want to exploit people for the good of the organization. They want to help people grow, which is good for them and the organization, right? It's both. So if people are growing, then they enjoy growing, they're getting better, and then they can perform better. That means the organization can do things it couldn't do before or do things better. And that means better able to serve people. So, you know, it's a triple win. That's very different from the idea that you can exploit people, even if you think it's for the good of the organization. Third is this idea of caring for all stakeholders. That means everybody who's affected by the organization. So we're talking about, of course, employees and customers. We're talking about investors. We're talking about members of the community. Everyone that is touched by the organization. That's the only truly moral position you can take. Because if you're having an impact on all these people, you really shouldn't say, well, I'm not going to care about them all. You need to care about everyone the organization touches. That's what servant leaders do, and that's unique. They're not focused only on shareholders or only on employees or only on customers. They look at all of them. Finally, this idea of humility, that servant leaders are willing to reflect and that this kind of helps them to keep their role in perspective. That servant leadership really isn't about the leader, it's about identifying and meeting the needs of others. And so this idea leads to humility. And humility is just so essential in servant leadership. I mean, if you're not humble, you just can't do it. I mean, people who lack humility, they're not going to listen. They're not going to grow people. They don't really want to work with people. They don't want to serve others. They want others to serve them. They just can't do what a servant leader does. We have the most amazing example of humility. That is Christ, as described in Philippians 2nd chapter. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name. And we're instructed in 1 Peter. All of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Humility is not about being weak or being filled with self-doubt. Blanchard and Hodges say, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking about yourself less. Another way to look at it is that it's not putting yourself down, it's lifting others up. Yes, we have important roles to play, but so do others. We have contributions to make, but so do others. We have things that we want to say, but so do others, and we should listen. Wilkes pointed out that humility is really having an accurate sense of who you are. Irwin said, you know, it's about understanding who you are, no higher and no lower, but being honest with yourself. The opposite of humility, vanity, pride, self-conceit, is a real problem. C.S. Lewis called it the great sin. In Mere Christianity, he said that pride is the total anti-God state of mind. It cuts us off from God. Humility connects us with God. Humility also connects us with other people. Aubrey Malphur says that humility is really important in a leader because Nobody likes an egocentric leader. Nobody wants to follow an egocentric leader. People want humble leaders who've got the right vision and don't go around looking down on other people. Laura Reeve is a scholar who studied the connection between spiritual values and leadership effectiveness. And she found that humility was very important. That people are very fascinated with charismatic leaders, but that the most effective leaders tended to be humble leaders who work quietly in the background. In fact, she had executives tell her that one of the biggest problems they'd had, where they'd really fallen and failed, was a result of their pride and their vanity. So humble leaders aren't trying to build a cult. They're not trying to build up a following. They're just trying to get everybody focused on the values and goals of the organization and how to build a really quality company that has excellence in all of its work and all of its products. Jim Collins wrote a book called Good to Great, and he found that the best leaders were really very humble. They were humble about themselves, and they were ferociously proud of their organizations, but they were very humble about themselves. And when you talked to them, they talked about their companies, they talked about other executives. They didn't talk about themselves. So they combined this personal humility with this deep loyalty to making their organization a success. Merwin Hayes and Michael Comer wrote a book called Start with Humility. And they found that humility was really essential to effective leadership. It was the way that leaders connected with their followers and built trust. That if you can express humility, if you can be humble, this creates a bond, kind of a common bond of humanity with those you're trying to lead. And that makes them effective. They become the kind of leader that people do want to follow. In summary, servant leaders have many characteristics. It begins with a desire to serve. Like Jesus, they are good shepherds. They are situational, they take risks, they give back, they are willing to stand for what is right. When you compare servant leadership with other ideas about leadership, you find at least 4 differences. There's this strong moral element. There's a focus on followers. There's a concern with all stakeholders. And there's this ability to promote humility in the leader. Humble leaders are able to connect with followers, build trust, and connect with them in ways that allow them to all move forward, doing God's work, whether it be in the ministry or the marketplace. Would anybody like to ask a question? Yes, please.
Well, in regards to humility, I find myself between a rock and a hard place because I love people and I'm very charismatic, I'm very outgoing and bubbly, and I love people, but yet it's hard for people to understand that although I'm a very bubbly, outgoing servant leader, I am very quiet and reflective. How do you find the balance between that? Because sometimes I feel a little guilty. It's like, should I back off or should I speak out more? Do you have any advice on that?
You know, I think that's a good question, and it's going to be hard to answer. But I think it really matters what the context is. You know, if you're in a situation where you don't know very many people, I think the most comfortable thing for me would be to focus on lifting them up and asking them and helping them to express themselves. If you're with longtime friends who've seen you in various situations and are still your friends, then you just don't worry about it. You know, you can just be as bubbly and outgoing as you want to be. So I think it's just, again, a matter of context and respect for other people as the relationship develops. How about another question? Yes.
Thanks, Dr. Keith. Everybody's different, and some people don't react as you would like to the servant leader model. what do you think the best way would be to persuade someone who isn't really used to or doesn't really react well to the leadership model that is the servant leader model you've spoken about today?
Oh, thank you for the question. You know, I think the best thing to do is to just do the things servant leaders do without giving a speech about it, without trying to persuade someone this is a model and you got to adopt the model. I think it's best to just start by doing the thing, paying attention to other people, identifying and meeting their needs. In the next module, we'll talk about key practices. So it's the idea of doing those things, and as people become interested in why you are doing them, then I think you have the opening to talk more and more about, well, this is a model, and this is where it comes from, and this is why I do what I do. But I'm glad you asked the question, because people are different. And even if you're not consciously talking about servant leadership, you know that there are different stages of development. They have different needs. Some people need more encouragement, some need less, some need more direction, some need less. So this idea, again, about being situational and adapting to the individual is still important.
I have a question for somebody who will be starting just in leadership in general. What would you say to somebody transitioning from maybe being around a power leader to a servant leader?
You know, I think it's as simple as asking yourself, why are you doing what you're doing? Are you doing it for yourself, or are you doing it for others? And I think that, you know, the world gets confused about, you know, what is self-sacrifice or what is self-denial. I don't think servant leadership is about self-denial at all. I think it's about self-fulfillment. But it's not about going for power, wealth, and fame. So it's not about being totally selfless. You get meaning and satisfaction. And in our case, we know we're doing what God has told us to do, what Christ has called us to do. So I would just start by shifting my focus to, how can I help these people? Whatever small thing, you know, I might discover by watching, by listening, by looking around, and just start there and see how you can grow and develop from that.